an intimate group tonight. So what questions do you have? Do you have things left over from Khenpo Rinpoche's teachings? Things that you remember? I saw a twitch there. Probably, if you think about it. Anything else?
I have one. I wrote them down, but accidentally left them at home, and so I'll just do it out of my head. But it had to do with the teaching about. Of course, I went online to make sure I got the spelling right and everything, and now I'm not remembering. But the teaching about how to make the wish upon our dying to go to the beautiful land?
Pure Land.
Pure Land.
Yeah.
The Pure Land as part of the, I think as I understood it, as part of the Bodhisattva path. I listened, there were some good questions when he taught that part. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed and confused by it. It seemed almost a little bit like sort of too good to be true. It seemed like it didn't fit congruently for me. Not that this only matters in my case, really, but it didn't fit congruently with me, with like my kind of intellectual reckoning with the Dharma. I remember growing up as a Catholic and being told that, like, if you're being a sinner and stuff, just remember, like, as you're laying there dying, at the scene of the car accident, just make sure you ask, Jesus to save you, and then you're good. You can go to heaven, kind of thing. And I remember thinking, this, just making this wish to go to this place, and then the story of how the daughter kind of cleverly got the father to the Pure Land, and a lot of it seemed a bit, I don't know how to, almost like kind of romantic. It didn't fit quite. But I'm contending with it. I guess I just don't understand it very clearly, and I guess I also wondered, like, is it a place? Like, is it a place? Like, is it like Portland? Like, is it a place we go, or is it a different, completely, utterly different realm? And how that fits in with our Bodhisattva path. And then there was the part about, I think, like, I remember he said that we can wish ourselves places, so when we die, we can then wish, like, if I wish myself, or I think of being in Paris, like, I'll be in Paris. If I think of being in Portland, I'll be in Portland, and I can see everybody around me, but I'll realize that I'm dead. Mm-hmm. And yeah, anyway, all of that just seemed pretty mind-blowing, and like I said, sort of hard for me to contend with as a real pragmatist, or I'm a person who's really skeptical of sort of notions that seem a little too good. I always think of the Dalai Lama's teaching, if something in the Dharma doesn't fit within science, within real science, we'll have to alter the Dharma. Like, it kind of, the part of me that believes definitely in real science and can't not believe in real science anymore, which is why I'm not really a Christian anymore. That part of me was struggling with those teachings that, kind of seemed a little romantic to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a short follow-on?
I want to ask you a question after you guys are
Okay, all right. No, it's right there. It was nibbling on your elbow. Yeah. It's interesting for me listening now, having lived with Lama Tinley here for, like, in the same house with him for 4 years, and then studied and practiced with him for another 6 or 7, like that. I got used to hearing this kind of this traditional perspective. And I never felt kind of a literal conviction in any of it. It just didn't strike me that way. So it ceased to go into a category where two things were actually trying to fight it out. It went more into a category of, if I look at it this way, what is accessible? What becomes accessible? And from that point of view, there is something that becomes accessible for me anyway. But I always have kind of in the back of my head, couldn't we figure out another way to say all this? Because I still have that. But there's something about stepping into a narrative where within the narrative you can see certain things that you can't see outside of that narrative, unless somebody comes up with another very clear way to express it. And so the notion of Pure Land, as far as I never learned the zip code or the area code or anything like that, the basic notion of that kind of comes together from two sides. One is that any circumstance could actually be fuel for liberation, for further ripening and realization. Any kind of circumstance could be, if we had the outlook that was capable of making use of it. So the notion that there could be more ideal circumstances doesn't seem unreasonable. And the wish to be open to circumstances ripening us spiritually seems to be a good idea. So there's that side of it. There's also the side of, and this is where I have to say I don't know how to explain this any other way, but the way that it kind of the narrative of Amitabha making wishes to be able to kind of hold that kind of situation for other beings. That one is like, I relate to that somehow, that somebody could actually have such a deep wish to be able to, you could say, like, I don't know, I go into things like a wave, create a wave in the fabric of interdependence that you could find and ride. And there's something in like empowerment ceremonies or sitting with truly remarkable masters of meditation, where it feels like, oh, I can actually feel this kind of wave. Something is easier in this situation than when I'm just sitting by myself. So I don't kind of dismiss the thought that when the grasping after this body as a kind of a basis for identity, when that grasping has no longer kind of a reliable object, no longer has the bird of consciousness no longer has that to return to say, yeah, this is where I am, this is who I am. It's easier for me to think of being able to then open to this kind of situation where ripening would be more would be facilitated in some way. But we don't have a really good modernist kind of this is the slick intellectual package for it that fits all the other views that we have in the world. And that may be good, because we might have dumbed down something if we got in a big hurry to repackage Amitabha's Pure Land as something that fit within something else. We might actually miss something, and that's actually one of the reasons that I'm really quite open to hearing things expressed in this way, because I do find something becomes accessible. And it's not a matter of I become convinced of some kind of picture, but something I can see something to open to, and some way to direct my mind, my attention, my intention. So it's interesting. I don't feel like I have an answer for that. I'm more just, you kind of shared kind of your collision with that, and this is my slow motion, the result of my slow motion collision with those teachings over many years now. Dora, do you have?
Well, it's a great topic, and well, at least I think I also don't have a highly traditional, literal stance towards this myself either. So, like Bill, what I'm saying is just my thinking about it, not a party line. But on the last point that the one you raised about people in the Bardo being in a blink somewhere, to me that part I don't have trouble with, because to me it feels like it's kind of like when you're dreaming, you can be anywhere, and you're similarly free of your body, really, when you're dreaming, right? Your body's not holding you down in the same way that it is when we're awake. So to me that seems really logical that it would be that my consciousness would be kind of disoriented by not, and maybe and not aware for a while that I didn't have a body. That kind of makes sense. We're pretty habituated to that. And then the idea that we could just think of somewhere and have experience of that place. Anyway, to me that seems consistent with my experience of dreams or whatever. But the other is pretty interesting. I feel like I have to ask myself, well, what is a Buddha? Like, do I think there's any Buddhas? So I guess actually I feel like there have to have been beings who attained Buddhahood. And if that's true, then I think that's a pretty extraordinary situation. And so I can't really imagine what they can and can't do. And I have the sense that, we're taught that these beings, that beings appear to us, which are out of being useful, or out of being, and that it's some of what we imagine, Buddhas or Bodhisattvas that we imagine and visualize, are not meant to be real. But Khenpo Rinpoche kept saying, they're something that we can relate, a way for us to relate to something that has no shape or form or color or, you know, whatever. But, I mean, it's sort of like putting a form on compassion. Like, to relate to it, we're given something more than, you know, than just have that, be that, you know. So, so I feel like, well, you know, the Buddhas can manifest things, or Buddha nature, you know, I don't know, enlightened mind can probably do things. And then I think about, you know, the teachings are that the teachers, it's like teachers and students have to kind of hook up and come together to make the Dharma happen. So, and we see real examples. Khenpo Rinpoche comes here from India. We prepare and we show up and we interact, and it's kind of magic to get the teachings of the Dharma. I mean, so that happened through his intention matched with our intention. So if you kind of ramp that up to like, well, if there's a Buddha who, you know, that enlightened mind has an intention to help beings, that is something that if I also turn my attention to that, you know, that we have kind of a meeting up, the, you know, the possibility of sort of meeting in that way, or in some way, that there's some significance to turning our attention to that enlightened intention. So so that's kind of how I think of it in kind of those more whatever, kind of less literal terms, and just thinking about, well, the time of death, the idea of aspiring to put our consciousness in a place that's an enlightened realm, and however that happens, but to have our mind directed in that direction seems to me like a positive, you know, that's a positive intention that would, you know, I could imagine it having results. But to say like exactly what that would be like, I'm not kind of convinced of exactly what it would be like, but that it, you know, there is some kind of sense behind there.
One other thing that came to mind, thinking about reports on near-death experiences where people do have some kind of experience of seeing things from a perspective that you can't get there to see it from there at that time and report on it from where they were, or you can't have figured it out beforehand. It couldn't have been part of somebody's memory, but they can accurately report on something. And those kinds of things leave me scratching my head in a certain way, because they're more kind of flying directly in the face of my ordinary materialistic view in a certain way than the stories of the Pure Lands, which I can just relate to as this helpful narrative. That's kind of there, but going, really? People came close to death, and then they talk about some conversation that was happening someplace else, and it was happening. That stuff's like, what? That one is like, And so that's that one, you know, like, well, okay, nobody's come up with an explanation of how that worked. Like all the rest of our materialist explanations go, So when I put some things like that kind of bend the mind about our ordinary materialist paradigm, which I'm generally take out on the road day in and day out and find pretty reliable. There's some kind of meeting there of those things. Well, there's more here than meets the eye, that's for sure. I don't know. It's an ongoing thing, I think.
Yeah, thank you guys. That's helpful. I guess, like I said, for me, I left Western religion it was very difficult to do, and it was very intentional. And there were certain things in the Dharma that brought me to it. The teaching, question everything that I teach, don't believe it if it doesn't make any sense to you. And so, there's this part of me that, I'm a therapist. I deal with a lot of folks that get caught up in magical thinking a lot, all the time. And, if I pray to God, I'll win the lottery, then I'll win the lottery, just all sorts of stuff. And, there's whole religions built on magical thinking. If we all kill ourselves together, we'll catch the spaceship. And I mean, there's just all sorts of magical thinking is woven into tons of religions. And I can't, as soon as I catch myself like trying to do that, I'm in big trouble, because then I'll have a spiritual and intellectual crisis. That's just not my road in this lifetime. And so I remember Eric was translating in almost after every line Eric would say, and this is very real, like he was talking about, she kind of cleverly sort of tricked her carpenter dad into going to the Pure Land. And I was just thinking, God, this seems like a lot of like magical thinking. Like, can I trick my carpenter dad into going to the Pure Land? And is there a Pure Land? And how can this be real? It just seemed like a story out of, it was almost like an ecumenical moment to me. It felt like I was the atheist reading about, Tibetan Buddhism. And here's a high ranking, Rinpoche telling a story, and me thinking, oh, that's cool. And that's just sort of like other neat stories from Hinduism or Western religions or something. But this is what I'm doing. This is not just me reading some neat folklore story from some religion. This is my guy. Like, I'm here, like learning from this guy, and all my struggles with, are you sure this is real? Like, it's useful. In the ecumenical moment. Yeah. And that was my question was like, can Mother Teresa like accidentally find herself in the Pure Land? Cause that would make sense to me, because, human beings, Buddhism's a pretty recent thing. It's only, a few thousand years old. Like, we've all been doing something for a long time, and there's a lot of people doing all kinds of stuff that have never heard of Buddhism. And, so I just was like kind of wondering is this like a cultural perspective on something that's valuable because it's a way to understand something through a cultural perspective? Or is it like kind of, a very special kind of like, engraved in cosmic stone sort of truth that we Buddhists have that no one else has? And so anyway, you guys' answers are helpful, and I'm still working on it, but it seemed very important to Kenpo to teach this stuff to us. And he kept having Eric say, and this is true, and this is true, it's real, it's real. And I was like, okay, this does not seem like something I should just toss aside as neat, Tibetan stuff. Like, I should chew on this, because this seems like he's come all the way here, and he's emphasizing this is the time he's got to talk to us. This is what he's talking about. And so I need to think about some of this.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I could imagine, there's some magical thinking where I can imagine, really, not only bad premise, bad mechanics, but bad outcome. So that's, and if I put this into the category of magical thinking, what's the result? What's the result of holding this view? Then I have to think, well, would somebody do something harmful to another person? Would they avoid medication that might save their life? So it's got to, or is this a good enough approximation of something kind of important to do, that it's like, it's beyond a benign kind of interesting artifact. It's actually for people who actually place themselves in that it actually it's a launch. It has some efficacy and some power just in itself, and I think we also do well to admit that we probably engage in a half a dozen magical thinking moments every day. And so it's kind of like, a little bit of humility from our side probably is in order. And then, but I think that the test, like, is somebody going to do something harmful? Are they going to ignore the needs of others? Well, those kinds of questions, I think those are like, if you can see any of that, it's like, woo, step back and say something.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good distinction.
I have a question that kind of starts out with sort of the same premise, but goes in a bit of a different direction. As you've already kind of pointed out, there's a lot of fantastical stories and sort of bizarre, almost like a modern world. Like, it seems like it wouldn't be entirely inappropriate to almost call them paranormal in some ways, because they don't seem normal to us. And I've always been very fascinated by this kind of stuff, but since before Buddhism. And I've always wondered if, ever since I began to learn about Buddhism in earnest, I've wondered if the view of impermanence and dependent origination and dependent arising and emptiness allows for these experiences to be viewed as valid and to be able to actually take them at face value without necessarily believing the mythology and the cosmology. I don't really know how to describe this.
Can you give one example?
The story of Milarepa, who was challenged by an academic to prove that space is solid and ground is I can't remember what the word was used. It wasn't empty, but was like permeable, or was
that you could pass through ground, but you couldn't pass through space.
And you could stand on air or something like that, or stand on space. And he did exactly that. He stood up in the air and then walked into the side of a cliff. It's like that's very difficult to believe at face value. However, humans living right now have described much more bizarre experiences than that, and have said, yeah, I saw this thing happen. And Western material society likes to treat these people like crazy people and invalidate them and humiliate them, basically. And I don't really believe that people go out of their way to be humiliated and to be invalidated. And so I don't really buy into the whole, they're looking for attention, they want to be on TV, they're making stuff up. So is there room in Buddhism for this stuff to be taken more seriously than we currently take it?
Well, I suppose there's always room, but there's a matter of priority, and there's a matter of utility. It's a much lower priority than developing bodhicitta. It's a much lower priority than gradually developing some familiarity with our own minds and our own experience. It's a much lower priority than behaving in an ethical way. The kinds of things that are described, like Milarepa and the story that you told of Milarepa, those kinds of things are the place where they fit in the stories is not in a place of you should believe that magical stuff happens just because it's kind of cool that magical stuff happens. The stories always have a very particular didactic purpose. And from my sense, the purpose in those particular stories where the limits of physical reality that we normally work with seem not to apply. For me, those have always been stories about how much of the potential for our experience as beings we do not see. That it's kind of like, it's so big, it's like somebody could walk through a wall. Which then, like, And it does have when we step into those stories, we do have some sense of, oh, the things that I'm just kind of in you could say just kind of an ordinary trance about taking for granted. Maybe I should look more carefully at all of my experience. But then you're right back to, I should become more familiar with my own mind and with all how experience arises in my own mind. So then that's where I go with that. You also have to read the teaching that say, oh yeah, people can do stuff like that, but it's really, those are just cheap tricks. That's cheap tricks compared to actually being of benefit to beings. So we tend to be highly entertained by these ideas. And you could say we're almost kind of like also, like basking in the reflected glory of Milarepa, who could walk through walls and stand in midair. It's kind of like, it's like a little embarrassing when you think about it. So again, I look for things that go back to what's actually important in the practice.
Thank you.
Do you have any?
I think. Hang on, I had something in my head I wanted to say. Sort of like yeah, I think that like that was it's hard to describe, but like I kind of ended up reaching a similar conclusion in that if these strange stories that I've read about and know about did indeed happen, they're still no more real than any other appearance that arises. So getting caught up in all that is kind of besides the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting caught up in it is beside the point.
Yeah.
Did you find some questions?
I guess maybe this previous question is part of the answer, but probably like a lot of people, past week, there's sort of a lot of mental numbness from the news of the world, and trying to meditate during that is like, it's a different experience. If you had something personal going on, you kind of know how you're being impacted by it, but then when it's sort of stuff that's portending and that you are fine, but you're mentally numb because it's all coming at you, and you should probably turn off Twitter and step away from the news for maybe 6 hours at a time as opposed to 10 minutes at a time. It was a very weird attempts to practice. I think probably at one point I just had my head in my hand, I was like, ugh. But I guess maybe some insight on how to move through that, how to make that practice beneficial, because it didn't feel very beneficial.
Why didn't it feel beneficial?
I kind of felt like in going into it, it's sort of like a numbness with flight or flight syndrome kind of at the same time. And it just sort of stays there. Your mind, because like sort of like your brain is sort of on a RPM mode that just is sort of churning and churning, and the practice didn't seem to change that churn for even a little bit. And
So
you come out of it and you still feel like you're churning.
Yeah. If you had instead of sitting there and making the effort to practice, if you had checked the Twitter feed one more time, do you think that would have been the same effect?
Yeah, I mean,
Really, you think it would have been the mind would have churned? It was the same as checking a Twitter feed.
I don't even know if I could distinguish it for a while this past week
Yeah.
in the various states.
Yeah. Well, the reason I put it that way is kind of like, well, so we do have some kind of ideas about meditation should be like this, and then I should feel better afterwards, not necessarily worse. But in situations like this, I think that just taking a break from doing the things that accelerated us into that, even though we don't necessarily feel like we really got to put the brakes on, but merely not accelerating it has a certain kind of benefit. And being witness to what's happened after we've held our foot on the accelerator for this length of time, being able to witness that has some benefit. It's impossible for us to think to make any other choices unless we witness the limitations of the choices that we've made. And that's often, I wouldn't say it's always, but very frequently that's not necessarily a pleasant experience. It's usually some degree of greater or lesser unpleasantness associated with that. So part of it is how we're relating to the stimulus in the first place, what we've set up in that, and what we can set up in relating to that. And one of the things is the contemplation of the faults of samsara. If we actually really do investigate that in a deep and personal way, not merely kind of reciting a kind of a catechism of everybody suffers, it's kind of rotten all over, but to really to look deeply at how different layers of suffering arise in our stream of being, and how pervasive this is. That I think is important, particularly for those of us who live in a circumstance where normal feels like kind of things are just sort of okay. Then when things are not okay, it feels like something truly abnormal is going on. And I'm not a big fan of having bad stuff happen just to kind of sort of you want something to cry about? I'll give you something to cry about. I'm not a fan of that. But there is something about understanding. If we read the stories about the Tibetans who left Tibet and the things that they went through, we're not talking about just kind of feel-good stories. Oh, yes, we just, we can just rise above it. These people went through hell. But then you looked and say, how did they go through that and retain the kind of the center of the spiritual center of gravity, and actually have it deepen? In many cases, they say it deepened from having to deal with those challenges. So looking at things like that, we can think, oh, how do I get closer to that center of gravity myself? How do I cultivate that over time? And the unfortunate news is that it doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen so quickly that when all hell breaks loose, we can suddenly kind of look it up and go to the index for dealing with all hell breaking loose. Okay, that's page 53. All right,
I agree. It didn't happen at all.
It's not going to happen like that. So part of this is being able to step back enough so that we realize, oh, here I see the work that I have to do. I have to take it seriously. And the main thing is actually in finding the core of it really is finding that the aspect of well-being that's not dependent upon things turning out a particular way or conditions being a particular way, and being able to have that kind of in the paramitas, it's patience, or is the term, but patience in this case doesn't mean willingness to wait in line. It's willingness to be in the midst of, or the capacity to be in the midst of difficult circumstances without being sucked in. So it's a gradual process, but first is actually I don't know what I'd say first is. I don't know what I would say first. But just noticing the dynamic and becoming convinced of some need to actually find a refuge other than my wish that all the political and cultural psychic mayhem that surrounds me, just having my wish fulfilled that everybody would go back and everything would go back to, quote, normal. Having a center of gravity that is not built around that. And it's difficult because we want things to be auspicious, not just for ourselves, but for everybody. We do want conditions to be workable, and we do want the world to be filled with kindness. We do want that, and it's worth doing what we can to make that come about. But it comes about from a place where we're actually able to find that some stability in our own minds. We're able to actually find kindness in the midst of things. And we're able to find those things and sustain them and grow them, even though situations are not going to quickly reverse themselves. And I have found it useful to read like Trungpa Rinpoche's biography of the period of time when they were leaving, and to read about some of the stories of those teachers and the things that people went through, and the things that ordinary people went through, and how they dealt with things. It's not easy.
Just Quickly. I think there's, for me, I can have a I mean, your thing about felt like meditation didn't really impact or something, and that can happen for me for a lot of reasons. But one can be if I don't really unhook my mind from the churn of checking the email, checking the news, whatever the thing, if I'm kind of in the middle of that, and if I don't really let go of that for my meditation session, then I feel I feel it continuing, and maybe how you describe. So I don't know if it's the same or not, but anyway, I've had that experience. And what I try to, I mean, there's a similar thing can be with health. I have sometimes just mentally I think of, well, how is it different when I suddenly have some diagnosis that is like freaking me out or scaring me, whatever, versus like when I think everything's going fine, and knowing that, it's not going to get better. It's going to be more the freaky stuff. So realizing that, like Bill was saying, like we need to get to the thing that's beyond, that's deeper than being blown about by health issues, by interpersonal issues, by political things, that we're really in the Dharma, we're really looking to be in touch with something very fundamental and very not something that's not blown around by those things, which doesn't mean ignoring them or anything. It doesn't mean that we don't just shut our ears and pretend that all isn't there, but that there is that fundamental goodness that is there that we can be in touch with, and a fundamental, I don't know, whatever it is, peace and a place that to approach the world from, that we need to really work to get more in touch with that. Because who knows how things are going. I mean, and you think about all the situations, like Bill's alluding with the Tibetans, but you can also, I think also, like, wow, there's so many people who are just living to, barely eke out enough nutrition for the day for themselves or their family or something. There's just so many lives that are so much more stressful than mine in so many ways, and yet, so that, that's why we practice, and that's what we have to practice to be able to get deeper than that. That's my thought.
In a way, it boils down to refuge. What are we actually relying on? And we can, if we have some appreciation for either a teacher or the Buddha, the story of the Buddha, turning our attention to that example, which is, when Buddha was on the verge of enlightenment, the story, it's a mythic story, but it actually has a really good didactic value. Mara, or the kind of, you could say, the king of delusion, sets forth all these images, all these beings who come, And some of them are absolutely horrific. This is like Mara sets forth the illusion that World War III is actually happening, and Buddha is right in the middle of it. Mara sets forth all the images, all the possibilities for if you could imagine, if you felt like completely bulletproof by being seduced by anything in the world, but there is the one little thing that could get in there and catch you. All those images came, and in the middle of that, the Buddha didn't ignore that, but the Buddha was not hooked one way or the other. So just remembering that as remembering refuge. Where is deep refuge? And then even if for just one breath, we can actually really then kind of remembering that vividly, and then with one breath actually just attend very vividly to the sensation of the breath. And place that in the center of awareness. Not try to meditate for a long time, because then it's just kind of like, well, our energy for meditation is very weak, and the energy that we've created by engaging with all these things is really strong. So like, who wins? Of course, all right? That energy is going to be stronger. But if we can witness that we can actually pay attention fully and be fully in connection with that breath, then we've actually proved, in a certain way you could say we've proved enlightenment is possible. We've proved that because we're not trapped. But we have to do it over and over again. We actually have to invest as much energy in not being trapped as we invest in being trapped. And since we've been investing so much energy in being trapped for so many lifetimes, we really have to put a lot more energy into the not being trapped piece and cultivating that. And then if we can also remember that it's not just us, it's all sentient beings. We're all in the same boat. And then it's kind of like, ooh, it's not just me. It's not my own personal horror show.
We should retweet our breath.
What's that?
We should retweet our breath.
Yes, there you go. If you can figure out a way to do that, we'd be on our way. All right, thank you for all your very good and challenging questions, for all of which I feel probably more benefit for me to hear them and wrestle with them than perhaps in attempting to answer them for you. So I thank you for that. But here we are, Sangha, working on things together. So, thank you. And we can dedicate the work we're doing.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thank you again.
Thank you.